Good morning, everyone. Compliments. Welcome to this amazing session on advancing uh, gender equity in the private sector, especially on the continent of Africa. I would like to thank the Africa Soft Power team for creating this opportunity for myself and others. And I'd like to welcome some of our distinguished speakers. We have Mr. Temi Popula, who is the GMD CEO of the Nigeria Exchange Group. A round of applause, please. Mrs. Siongo Kisoso, Managing Director at BK Capital. Mrs. Rosalind Akinyi Walenda, Africa Director at Practical Action. And Mr. Chike Obianwu, Deputy Managing Partner at Templars. All right, so keywords for this panel: practical action, gender equity, workplace dynamics, productivity, advancing socioeconomic impact. So we're gonna dive right in. And I'm going to start with my sister in humanity. Rosalind, how are you doing today?
Fine.
So we want to just set the tone for creating foundational understanding. Is your microphone working?
No, it is, yeah. Good morning.
Are we good? Are we
I'm
good?
good, I'm good.
All right,
Good,
great.
Yeah.
So to set the tone and use this opportunity to also tell us about the work that you do at Practical Action. So we want to understand the foundational issues and creating an understanding for everyone here in the room and understanding what the specific barriers faced in Africa are. What are the main challenges that African organizations, whether public or private, face in achieving gender equity, especially in the workplace?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and really privileged to be on this panel. So that's a very interesting question. So just to set the tone on that, and just picking up also from what we just heard from the previous panel, gender barriers are prevalent in Africa across the world. And I think for me, just to make a bit of a caveat, I've often had, when we're talking about gender and gender barriers, the whole correlation with gender issues in Africa and in Europe and the US. I work in a sector where there's a lot of programming, a lot of discussions on gender. A few years back, I had the opportunity to work in Europe, and I was leading a global program on women's leadership and peace and security issues. And it's during that time that it became very obvious to me what some of the differences were. And this has also shaped the way I look at gender, the way I engage with gender. And I've always been of the opinion that gender issues in Africa require African solutions, that we discuss gender from the perspective of an African and co-create solutions that are relevant for us. And this also comes from I don't know if any of us know that even before the Beijing conference, the discussion around gender, maybe they didn't call it then, started with women in Zimbabwe. When they were talking about, these were women in the agricultural sector who were talking about equity in relation to them not having access to means of production, despite the fact that they were the ones who were basically tilling the land. And so the barriers that we have, there are some that are similar in terms of some of the ones that have been mentioned, in terms of women at the decision-making level, women not having access to healthcare and education, women not being able to advance in their careers. And that's something we do need to basically address. When you think about the private sector and investment into equity, look at the population that we have. Imagine if we could raise the purchasing power of women and what that could actually do in transforming, the private sector and even profits in the private sector. So I believe that we have unique barriers, access issues, access to financing for women entrepreneurs who want to start, access to knowledge or who owns the knowledge. Those are issues that we definitely do need to address and really look at solutions that are relevant for us on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Roslyn. I remember when I was doing a read up about practical action, you had a very unconventional tagline. We put ingenious ideas to work so people in poverty can change their lives.
Absolutely. Practical action is not one of those conventional NGOs. We work a lot with private sector. I'm just thinking about one of the projects that we've had that I think has been really interesting in terms of co-created ideas with businesses. We came up with a solution to solve the issue of distribution of products in the energy sector. And that called for a co-creation with different communities, understanding what the community needs were, and also with businesses. Businesses wanted to make profit, but at the same time, they want to move their products, but then they want to do it in a conventional way, not just in the shops. So the Global Distributors Collective was an idea that came up and we incubated it. Since 2001 to date, the Global Distributors Collective has been able to reach about 6.4 million people with products in energy sector, in agriculture, in health. The thing about that is, apart from just creating jobs, businesses have also benefited because they've made more profits, their produce are moving. But more importantly, we've managed to have 40% of distributors are actually women, and they add more products to the work, to what they send out. And our target group has been the last mile groups. Now, why is that important? I think that those thinking outside the box, finding a solution and collaborating and co-creating leads to us being able to address some of the gender equity issues that we're discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Roslyn. So, Siongo, I'm going to throw this question to you. When you hear conversations around gender equity, access to finance is always at the top of the conversation. Now, access to finance is an indicator. However, what's your relationship or what has been your experience with women and access to finance, but also in terms of investment banking, as well as what BK Capital does?
Thank you for that. I mean, in terms of access to finance, the numbers are not encouraging. Like if we look at the volume, or rather the volume of funds that go towards sustainability, globally you have like 1 to 3% going towards gender lens financing, which is a paltry amount, and I think there are a number of reasons why this is the case, and I'll give my point of view as an investment banker who supports clients access financing. I think the problem is both on the owners of capital and those who need capital. So on the owner's side, I think we have a lot of investors who are not pushing for the agenda. I think first, we need a lot more tracking of the progress that's being done, but we don't have a lot of boardrooms that have gender benchmarks as their KPIs. And I think ultimately we can only manage what we track. So I think that's the first thing. So as stewards of capital, as stewards of change, we need asset owners, so this pension funds, private equity funds, whoever they may be, pushing that agenda and pushing for these benchmarks to be tracked. I think at the very, that's a very easy start. And I think once we start having this, we will see change. So BK Capital is an investment bank that's owned by BK Group, a Rwandan based financial services group. And one of our focus areas is to be employer of choice and to have really customer-centric innovation. And within that, we have across all the subsidiaries, we're all given a KPI for gender um, diversity. So it's different based on what your starting point is. But just having that KPI has changed the dialogue. When we think about how we develop, how we coach, how we promote, how we hire, and I think that from an asset owner perspective would make a difference. I think the second one is really having more capital allocated towards gender lens investing. So this is really one, having a cap where investors do need financial returns, but then really being dedicated to strategies whereby you are allocating money to women-owned businesses, to businesses that serve, women well-being, to businesses that are, committed to gender equity within their senior leadership, etc. So I think a lot more needs to go towards that. And also, on the part of institutions such as ourselves is really, looking for opportunities and educating both asset owners and those who need access to finance on these particular strategies. On the side of needing the capital, I think there are pools of funding out there, but they haven't been fully tapped. Yeah, so I think a lot more awareness and education needs to be done. Tanzania issued the first gender bond 2 or 3 years ago. It was oversubscribed. It was immensely successful. It has gone a long way in, in promoting or advancing access to finance for women owned businesses in NMB. But how many of these bonds have been issued since then? We have asset owners who actually quite frequently reach out and ask, we have a pool of funding dedicated to sustainability. Within that, we must allocate a certain amount towards the S in ESG, and we, really would like to see more in gender equity, and we're just not coming up with that pipeline. So I think there needs to be more awareness done. And then something that was raised by my fellow panelists is, besides being able to access or have a pool of financing, I think a lot more needs to be done in building capacity and readiness to have these funds. So I think to tackle it, asset owners and those who actually need financing have a role to play.
Thank you, Siongo. Chike, so Templars, it's an African law firm. I know about Templars. I'm pretty sure it's a very familiar name here in the room. We're talking about advancing gender equity, especially for businesses that need to make a profit. Access to finance is not so great right now. So from your own perspective, what are some practical strategies that have been implemented over the last few years in the private sector that have moved the needle, especially when it comes to the gender equity indices?
Thank you very much for that. I think if we're talking gender equity and to make progress, right, and I will give you a few examples that I'm familiar with. I think what is important, or what I've seen that is important, is for there to be structure around what we're doing. The stats are clear as to what the challenges, the barriers are, and we can talk about them if we have the time. But in terms of practical action, there's need for structure, There's need for collaboration. There's need for understanding that not one size fits all, but also there's no one specific strategy to adopt. So it's going to be a combination of a lot of things. It's got to be things like set aside, quotas, targets, as unpopular as they may be in some quarters. It's got to be education, sensitization, dealing with cultural barriers, cultural mindset issues, and I'll talk about one or two of those, right? It's got to be thinking about how, from a business perspective, overcoming gender disparity actually has an impact on the bottom line. So if I think about those, I've seen studies from, and Temi is here from the Nigerian Exchange Group, and he can talk about some of these. But we've seen initiatives from people like the IFC and the NGX measuring performance in the Nigerian private sector. And we saw movement in terms of representation of women. And some of these are because there are certain standards that are being required of people. There's also the need for transparency. So when you require businesses to publish numbers, sometimes it may be just to drive a reputation, but also the education that you add to that may then make businesses realize that it's not just about looking good, it's also about doing well, because statistics and research shows that gender diverse businesses, gender diverse leadership produces much more profitable outcomes, right? Now, I speak specifically about the need for private sector to collaborate with other parts of society. The Obi Furniture is here, and there's the cultural aspect of things and the limitations that imposes. So for us as a firm, we have also embarked upon educational initiatives to enable people free their minds of certain prejudices, cultural assumptions that actually produce these problems. Now, when I was studying for the Nigerian bar, say 25 plus years ago, right, I came across a case, a decision of a Nigerian judge, where there had been a defilement of a 10-year-old by some man, I don't remember how old. And in sentencing the convict, the judge gave leniency because the convict promised to marry the victim. Now, I don't know when that case was decided, but it was something I encountered 25 plus years ago as someone studying for the bar. Now, a few weeks ago in Nigeria, a Nigerian lawmaker announced an initiative to marry off 100 orphan girls. In his mind, it was social impact. He was trying to free them of poverty. He was trying to better their lot. So if you look at this individual, the judge who 20 plus years ago gave leniency because the convict, the rapist, the molester, assailant promised to marry the victim. Now, you jump 30 years plus after, we have a lawmaker who's looking to marry off 100 orphans, well-meaning. So there you have a challenge that it is not the bad ones amongst us. It is those who think they are doing good that, in addition to the bad ones, we need to target to make the change in mindset that is necessary to take us where we need to go. And so the private sector, working collaboratively with traditional leadership, working collaboratively with government, working collaboratively with educational institutions, needs to target these sorts of barriers to ensure that there is correction in terms of what makes sense, what is right, and also correction in the minds of women themselves to make them free to pursue the opportunities that are available and that should become available for us to achieve gender parity.
Thank you for that. The example that you gave was made waves in the news. And like you said, it was the person thinking it was well meaning and it was social impact. But the backlash was that you don't even know who's marrying these, orphaned girls. Your intention might be great, but you might be throwing them.
But it shouldn't even matter who's marrying them.
Yeah.
It's why should a lawmaker?
Why should they be married
Yeah.
without their, consent? That's one. And two, there were so many conversations around it, and I'm glad the Minister of Women Affairs in Nigeria stepped up and got an injunction from another judge to halt the process, which evidently is still in conversation right now. But you referenced a report from the NGX, and I'd like to throw this question to Temi. What would you say is the most encouraging principles or best practices that has been implemented in the last few years? I mean, since NGX went public 11 years ago, and just give us some examples or highlight some areas that have been picked out from the report so we can discuss it more.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. What I should do before I address the question directly is maybe also add some context. And that context is from the lens of an employer as well. I work for a firm where we hire people. And then, of course, overseeing the exchange, I work for an institution that has, I would say, strong convening power, which would address the question that you make, that you ask. I think from the lens of being an employer, what I think is that this conversation is at a slightly higher level of consciousness than maybe events like this would suggest. In other words, I think there's a general level of understanding and acceptability that it does make sense to hire women. Again, I use that carefully at a level of where most of the people in this room have influence. This is generally known. I mean, so Chike is a managing partner of a law firm in Nigeria. I don't think you need to tell him about the benefits of, gender balance and all of that. And I'm sure many people in this room. Now, what I've seen as a potential challenge is two things. One is, I think because we then focus so much on what is a bit obvious, it almost looks like we're doing a favor to the women. So I see that firms are almost, rather than juggling the best guy versus the best woman, you're juggling a guy versus a female. So two different kinds of conversations. And increasingly, you would find that even women are beginning to have challenges with that. Don't patronize us. And I think the conversation needs to start to get to that level, because what it then does is a message also to the women. I think women want to compete at this, not because they're women, but they want to compete at this because they are the best. So that if you have to change that conversation where it's like, well, let's extend an olive branch because they're females, then you get into a territory that's a bit tricky. If I run a company and I have a fiduciary responsibility to do the absolute best for that company, then it's a bit tricky if I'm hiring because you're female. So that's the first point. The second point also that maybe is not so obvious is actually that there is a deficit of actually just good women, good men, good people, period. There's a huge acute shortage, at least in the space that I operate in. And a big part of the conversation then has to start to address that. How do we make sure that we're churning out the right people, the right women? How do you empower them to ensure that, the conversation is at that level? Because once it's there, frankly speaking, yes, the prejudice does still exist, but I feel like we're spending too much energy balancing a prejudice that vis-a-vis what all this energy should go into can be balanced. Now, from the lens of the exchange, trying to get to the question that you ask, we've done a few things. We've first of all asked ourselves, where is our strength here? Our workforce isn't that large. So even if we said as a business, let's hire women, that's fine. But we found that we have very strong convening power across two different areas. One, we're able to convene people with the real voice and muscles, people like the IFC and the DFIs. And number two, we have all these corporates that are listed on our exchange. Those corporates have a supply chain. They have corporates that supply things to them. They have corporates that do business with them. And we thought to be at the center of that and to bring those two worlds together, which is some of the report that Mr. Obianwo was speaking to. So we've gone into several kinds of partnerships. One very notable one was one with the IFC in 2021, where we worked with them and they graciously funded this thing that we had called the Nigeria to Equal program. And the first bit of that was just to do research, because that's the other bit that tends to be missing in these conversations, is that you actually have to run numbers One of the things that we found is that in Nigeria, at least based on the data that IFC ran, was that we weren't too far away from global averages. We had roughly about 23% women in executive positions. We had about 20% women in board level positions. It was not too far from sort of global averages. Now, speaking very loosely, you'd look at Nigeria, you'd say it's Africa, you'd say they're backward and there aren't women represented. The data didn't quite suggest that, as an example. So we went first into research to gather a lot of these, and then more practically, then to come up with recommendations that we thought would actually really move the needle. And some of those recommendations included things like paternity leave. So today we're trying to codify in sort of the ethos and the corporate workspace a 2-week compulsory paternity leave, for example, that's fully paid. We are trying to look at even policies around maternity leave. How much do you actually pay for what length of time, and find ways to add some pressure to that. We are also trying to apply leverage on our listed corporates. Like I said earlier, what sort of reporting do they do on this subject? What sort of leverage do they also extend on their supply chain? How do they empower businesses that are owned by women? And so I think around there's quite a bit to unpack. But from the lens of our business, this is how we've thought about it. Drive it through data, drive it through things that are measurable, and elevate the conversation so that ultimately the decision making is less man-woman, which will still come, but it's really around how do you hire the best talent? And if women are not the best talent, which is not my view, right? Because I find, and I'm sure again, no one in this room would argue that, for example, I've got 2 kids. My daughter's younger than my son. She's younger, but I can see a lot more maturity in her already. Women are just like that. Earlier, they spoke about how women are the neck and the head and that sort of analogy. It's facts. We can see that. So back to what I was saying is that we see that very quickly the conversation just needs to be elevated. And let's empower women, make sure that they're the very best, and then that conversation changes, and I think we'll see a lot more outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Temi. So let's cut through the filler words. And this question is to every panelist here. What have you done in the last 3 to 5 years in your company to advance gender equity, or in your place of employment, or in your community? Clear examples. Can start with you, Chike.
Okay, what have I done? I think one of the things that are important is flexibility for women. Another thing that's important is figuring out why is it the case that at the start of our careers or their careers, we find that we have more women than men.
My question is, what have you done?
Okay, so what
Not
have I
what
done?
you plan to do,
No.
or what
See,
you're hoping
what
to
I've done-
achieve.
No, I tell you what I've done. What
Okay.
I've done is I have targeted the reason why women drop off in the middle. And I have offered flexibility so that today we have women that work at Templars who sit in different parts of the world. I have offered flexibility in terms of the time that you start work and close work, and in terms of where you do it. That makes a difference. Now, paternity leave is something we've introduced, and ironically, you say, why paternity leave when we're talking about women? But paternity leave probably also enables the men to spend more time doing what the women are doing and freeing up the women after childbirth to go back to work. So these are some of the things that I have done.
Thank you. Rosalind?
Thank you. That's a good question. But before I respond, I think I wanted to comment on one of the Temi's. You mentioned something about talent, and you said something like, do women have that talent? I think it's a question I've had so often, which I totally disagree with.
I think you misunderstood his point.
I could have.
Because it's very tricky to misunderstand what he just said regarding talent. Temi, can you please clarify it again?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. You see, sometimes
do.
that's why these things are tricky conversations.
Yes.
I'm glad everybody heard what I said and, could identify with it. Good fact check. So here's what I said. I said that the conversation needs to change. Today, the current conversation appears to be women versus men. The conversation needs to be about hiring the best talent that actually happens to be women. It's a different kind of conversation.
Great.
So that what that does is as follows. rather than looking down at these women, because that's kind of how the conversation tends to be these days. What have you done? I could tell you, well, I've asked that we hire more women. It's not the right answer to a
Yeah.
question like that.
Okay.
It is patronizing. That's the first thing I said. Number two, I also said that the conversation you would find increasingly is there is a scarcity of good talents, period. Whether they're men, whether they're women. It's just a pure statement of fact. Today, I'm looking for many roles to
You
fill.
get it now?
Better now?
Now I get it. Okay, now do you have something?
Thank you, Temi.
Cool.
I get you. I get you now because you're right that we hear that over and over
time.
again
All the time.
across all the sectors. You know, and we do indeed have to change that conversation because the talent is there.
Yeah.
You know. So
Okay, so
just
answer my question now.
just to answer your question, okay, some of the strategies I have implemented, not just in this role, but I just made it a point across every space that I'm in, is basically to make sure that in every organization I work with and all the partners that we partner with have inclusive hiring practices and career development, targeting women. So adopting practices that actively seek to empower gender representation at all levels. So issues around mentorship programs, leadership program, and also succession planning that actually prioritize the advancement of women is so important because then you get women through that chain into the levels that you want. Secondly, also very intentional investment in women entrepreneurs from the example that I just gave. So supporting that through sometimes linking them up to financing, you know, access to markets. That's something that we've done. And also workplace policies and culture, flexible working conditions. Now, the issue of culture for me, I think, is also very important because there's also that within the workplace culture, there's the politics and the attribution. The reason why I mentioned the politics, I think we had this also in the last group that spoke, whereby if you find yourself as a woman in a certain level of leadership, there's some type of politics that comes to play that becomes very detrimental to women's performance. So I've had a lot of experience with that. So I've had to be very politically savvy in my workplace. So being aware how to deal with that, but also employers being aware that having a woman in a leadership position, there has to be a conducive environment for that woman to perform. You know, that goes also for women also in political spaces. So that and also partnerships and collaborations, very big on that also. So those indeed do contribute very significantly to gender equity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Siongo?
Thank you for the question. I think in terms of what we've done as an institution is we continuously look for ways to create a level playing field. Because I think that's really one of the barriers towards gender equity. Tactically, things that have been done in the recent past, we built a new nursing center. So I think, there was an observation that, a lot of recent moms were experiencing inconvenience or discomfort in the way they have to nurse after they give birth. So there's a room where, there's privacy, there's comfort, it's well equipped, there are fridges, etc., just to really create, a more level playing field. This has been in place for a while within the group. I wouldn't say the last 3-5 years, but there is a nursing hour for new moms coming out of maternity leave, just to ensure that that transition is a lot smoother. Recently, we put in place some guidelines on flexible working. One thing I think generally, and it's something that, these are the small things that I think men can get better at, is you find that, when it comes to picking kids, dropping kids, there's most of the times there's a mother and father, but a lot of the time you find it's a mommy role. So just to really create a fair playing field, and to allow people to be more comfortable. We have flexible working hours, which allow for those kind of arrangements. And really, as leadership, we do have KPIs on gender diversity. So we're really put in a place where we have to continuously think on how we can promote the topic. And I think it was something great that was put in place. And I think it's all driven by the context we're in. There is political commitment, there is institutional accountability here in Rwanda to promote gender equality, and we see that trickling down to the private sector, and it's something that we have top of mind as the leaders in the organization.
Thank you, Temi.
Thank you very much. So we've done a few things.
So you have to be clear now.
I know. I was going to say.
Okay, no minced words. Tell us what you've done. Go ahead.
Nice words. We've done quite a bit.
Okay.
We've taken both a direct, a semi-direct, and an indirect approach. By direct, I mean that today, as a business, we are the first exchange globally that is EDGE certified. First company in Nigeria, first exchange globally. And this was a job done with and by the IFC that essentially came in. It looks at all your internal sort of procedures and policies around gender gap in particular, pay gap. And then there's an audit independently of that. And we came through on the back of that. Now, that also had outcomes as to what we could do sort of differently and better. So the very first thing to take away from there is just the consciousness that we have as a business around this subject matter directly. Again, still speaking directly, we have several roles to fill today in the business. And I've made clear, find me the best woman who is the best person for this role. We need to balance that. I'm looking at the data, and the data is now increasingly skewed. And this is probably because of structural things we've just done recently as a business. And I've said, look, this thing needs to be balanced. And away from that, let me talk maybe semi-directly, as I've said. We also have a few companies that we have, call it leverage over, associate companies, related companies, even our businesses. When you then think about governance, right, which is also a critical bit to this, also because I think as this conversation happens, one also needs to think through what aspects you have strongest leverage, right? If I'm able to hire a female as an entry level, or I'm able to influence the chairman of a company board to be female. Those are two different kinds of conversations and two different things that you need to put emphasis on. So it's not lost on us that, as we look across many of the things that we have influence over, we continue to take that lens. When I talk now about perhaps less direct, is then a few areas. We work with our regulators today, for example, when you look at the labor laws, some of the things I spoke about earlier. How do we use the strength of the exchange to make sure that things like, the minimum level of pay that you pay someone who's on maternity leave is at a certain baseline level. We've used the 66% level for that. How do we work with these corporates of ours that I said, all the listed corporates, the level of disclosure that we're requesting of them and of their, call it supply chain entities as well, we've raised that level of conversation. And then finally, partnerships. We're a member of a Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative. We are part of the IFC, part of several DFIs, where we continue to use our platform. Every learning opportunity that we have, every potential partnership. I'm here partnering with, the sponsors and the promoters of this event strictly because of that lens. I said to Nkiru, I don't know when last I did this for any event, strictly for this very busy calendar, but I think it shows you the ethos and the lens that we wear around this, because for us as a business, it's beyond any doubt. You need right quality women because the data support it. That's the only time you have a sustainable business. It's the time you have a profitable business. Thank you.
Thank you, Temi. So to round up our exciting session, we understand that Africa is the next best thing. Africa is on the mouth of everybody, and we're supposed to be the next global game changers. However, we also know that the solution for African problems can only be made or created from Africans. Do we all agree with that statement? Temi, you agree with my statement that the solution for African problems can only be created by Africans themselves. So what does that say Should I repeat myself?
If I heard, or maybe you should, so that
African
also, because I
problems.
disagree with what I think I heard.
Problems, African solutions by Africans for Africans.
I disagree.
Wow.
And I will tell you why. I think also as we deal with this matter, we've also got to be careful not to be too nationalistic on some of these things. There are certain problems we're dealing with that other people have dealt with.
So that leads me to my question, which
Yes.
is my final question to the panel, because we're out of time. Global best practices, is it sustainable or can it be applicable for African problems? Or do we create our own?
Can I?
Yes, we have 30 seconds.
I mean,
because they're signaling me.
I think it's such an obvious point, right? And Temi makes a good point to say, look, you don't reinvent the wheel, right? So problems that have been solved elsewhere, you take the formula from elsewhere and then you adapt it to your locale, to your circumstances. So there are certain peculiar African challenges that we have to take account of in thinking about gender parity. I spoke about culture, for example. Culture is often an excuse that we rely on to perpetuate certain things certain outcomes that shouldn't be the case. So even when you interrogate culture, you may find that some of the things that are touted as ancient practices and cultures are probably more recent and probably learned rather than indigenous. And for example, women in leadership. There are several examples from African history of women in leadership, women in businesses. The European Furniture is here, and if you had the opportunity to speak to him, he will tell you that in the kingdom that he runs, we used to have an office called the Omo Furniture, right? And that was a very powerful woman, right? So if you look inside of Africa, you have to tackle things like the abusive use of the concept of culture. You have to deal with educational and outreach measures that are peculiar to the African situation to solve the African problem. And finally, and I think Temi is probably right that we can't say it's just us as Africans, but I think the point about Africans solving African problems is that at a certain point, we should stop expecting to be handed out solutions. We should stop expecting the rest of the world to solve our problems. It doesn't mean that we don't require the rest of the world. It just means that we take leadership and be cognizant of the fact that you have to take your destiny in your own hands. I think that essentially that's it.
Thank you very much for that. One, I do believe that the work of, creating fair gender equity on the continent starts with dialogue, which is why Africa Soft Power is important. Conversations like this are important. Having representation, more representation for the male counterparts on a panel like this is also important. The second one is the action. And that's why my question was very important. What have you done? Plans are great, but we need to actually put it into action, talk about it so that other people can also learn from it. I mean, we also need more disruptive ideas, frankly. We can't keep doing the same thing, paternity leave, best hiring practices. Surely there has to be someone that will come up with something more disruptive that we can all adopt. And then the third part is consistency. We cannot remove our legs off the accelerating pedal. We have to continuously talk about this, enforce it, make sure we highlight it, we celebrate it, and hopefully next year we're going to be talking about what more have we done. Instead of the last 3 years, it will be from the last Africa Soft Power Summit to today, what have you been able to achieve? So thank you so much to my wonderful speakers. Thank you so much to the organizers. Thank you everyone for listening.